Imagine this, a black CEO, dressed for success, walking confidently to board her first-class flight. But just before she steps on the plane, security surrounds her and pulls her off as if she were a criminal. What they didn't know: she was about to sign a $5 billion deal with that very same airline. And after this humiliation, she made a decision that shook the entire company to its core. Imagine this. You've worked your whole life for success. The late nights, the impossible deadlines, the sacrifices no one ever saw, you've conquered them all. And now, you're walking through the airport, proud, confident, and ready to board a flight that would take you to yet another important business meeting. Your first-class ticket is tucked securely in your purse, a symbol of the position you've earned after years of determination. That was the exact moment when Maya Johnson's world shifted. Maya wasn't just any traveler. She was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world. A woman of poise, power, and influence, she was known in her industry for her sharp decisions and fearless leadership. But on that day, in the middle of a bustling airport, none of that mattered. As Maya approached the first-class priority boarding gate, dressed in a sleek coral red dress with her phone in hand, two uniformed security officers suddenly stepped forward. Their expressions were stern, their tone commanding. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside," one officer said, his voice carrying across the terminal. The air seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Passengers who had been distracted by their phones or busy wrangling luggage now turned their heads. Within seconds, dozens of curious eyes were locked on Maya. She blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me? Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he gestured for her to move. "Please, come with us." Confusion rippled through the waiting crowd. Whispered comments started to spread like wildfire. "Why are they stopping her?" someone murmured. "She must have done something," another voice whispered. "Maybe she doesn't belong in first class," said a passenger, not even trying to lower their voice. Maya held up her ticket, the bold letters "first class" printed clearly on it. "I have my seat. I'm supposed to board with this group," she explained, but her words were ignored as though they meant nothing. The security officers didn't check her ticket. They didn't ask her any clarifying questions. They didn't even give her the courtesy of an explanation. Instead, they flanked her on both sides and began escorting her away from the gate as though she were some kind of criminal. Phones immediately went up. A wave of clicks and flashing lights filled the terminal as people snapped pictures and began recording videos. In today's world, nothing stays private. Within seconds, dozens of strangers were capturing Maya's humiliation. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from guilt but from sheer disbelief. She had been stopped before in her life, questioned unfairly, doubted because of her skin color or her age, but this was different. This was public. This was humiliating. And worst of all, it was happening in front of an audience that seemed more entertained than outraged. She could hear bits of their comments as she walked. Did she sneak into the first-class line? Look at her, she doesn't look like she belongs there. I knew something was off. Maya clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay composed. Years of being underestimated had taught her one thing: never let them see you break. Still, inside, a storm was brewing. She thought about the absurdity of it all. She wasn't just any traveler trying to board a plane. She was flying to finalize a partnership deal worth billions of dollars, billions that could change the future of the airline itself. And yet, here she was, being marched away in handcuffs of prejudice, judged not for her achievements but for the way she looked. To the passengers, this was just another airport drama, something to post on social media for likes and comments. But to Maya, it was more than that. It was a turning point, a defining moment that would not only alter her relationship with this airline but also send shockwaves far beyond the walls of that airport. As she was led away, her eyes caught the bold letters of the sign above the gate: first class, priority boarding. She allowed herself a bitter smile. She had worked her entire life to reach first class. She had earned it through grit, intelligence, and sacrifice. And yet, in that moment, two strangers had decided she didn't belong, without even bothering to look at the truth in her hands. That sting, that blatant injustice, lit a fire in Maya's heart. She didn't know it yet, but this humiliating walk through the terminal would be the beginning of a storm that would cost the airline far more than they could have ever imagined. Because Maya Johnson wasn't just any passenger. She was the one person they couldn't afford to treat this way. Maya sat in the cold, sterile security room, its white walls humming under the fluorescent lights, its air thick with suspicion. A simple wooden table sat in the middle, and across from her, two officers shuffled papers as if they were preparing for an interrogation. She leaned back in her chair, calm on the outside but boiling on the inside. It wasn't the first time Maya had been underestimated, but there was something about this moment, about being dragged in front of a watching crowd, her dignity stripped away, that stung deeper than anything she had endured before. One of the officers cleared his throat and asked, "Are you sure this ticket belongs to you?" The question hung in the air like an insult. Maya raised her eyebrow, almost amused at the audacity. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out the boarding pass. The words were printed in bold, impossible to miss, first class, seat 2A. "This is my ticket," she replied firmly. "And I suggest you actually read it this time." But instead of apologizing, the officer pressed further. "You understand first-class boarding is reserved, right?" "Reserved for who?" Maya shot back. "People who look a certain way? People who fit into your idea of wealth?" Her voice was calm, but her words cut like glass. The other officer avoided her eyes, flipping through her ID and passport as if searching for something, anything, that would justify their treatment of her. Meanwhile, the humiliation grew heavier. Outside the small room, she could still hear the faint buzz of passengers gossiping. Their voices echoed in her memory, "She doesn't belong here. Maybe she stole the ticket." Those whispers weren't just casual comments. They were echoes of the same prejudice Maya had faced throughout her career, moments where her competence, her success, even her humanity, had been doubted simply because of who she was. She thought back to her early days in business, walking into boardrooms filled with older men in suits who looked at her as if she were in the wrong place. Back then, she had swallowed the sting, worked harder, proved them wrong. But now? Now she had nothing left to prove. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was her assistant. Maya answered with a steady voice, though her eyes burned with fury. "Cancel the meeting," she said. There was a pause on the other end. "Cancel, ma'am? But this deal." "Cancel it. We'll be making a statement to the airline instead." The officers glanced at her, realizing slowly that they weren't dealing with an ordinary passenger. But still, the arrogance lingered. They continued to ask meaningless questions, circling around the same implication: "You don't belong in first class." Maya crossed her arms and studied them. "Do you know who I am?" she finally asked. The officer smirked. "Ma'am, everyone says that." Her lips curled into the faintest smile. "No," she said, leaning forward, her voice low and steady. "You really don't know who I am." At that moment, the humiliation transformed into resolve. She could feel it like a shift in the air. She realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been stopped, questioned, or doubted because someone else decided they didn't look like they belonged. But Maya also knew something the officers didn't. She knew that in less than 24 hours, the consequences of this so-called routine security check would explode beyond the walls of this airport. Because she wasn't just a woman with a first-class ticket. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, the same company negotiating a massive partnership with this very airline. A deal worth $5 billion. And in their arrogance, these officers had just handed Maya all the leverage she needed to turn her humiliation into their downfall. She sat back in her chair, no longer bothered by their stares. Let them doubt her, she thought. They had no idea what was coming next. Time dragged on in that small security room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the tension thickened with every passing second. Then the door opened. In walked the airline's duty manager, his suit slightly wrinkled, his expression nervous. He had been alerted that a passenger, pulled aside for suspicious activity, was creating a stir. The crowd outside was still buzzing, passengers live streaming and posting videos that had already begun gaining traction online. The manager glanced at Maya, then at the papers the officers had scattered across the table. His eyes widened when he read the name on the ticket. "Maya Johnson," he said, his voice carrying both shock and recognition. Maya tilted her head, arms folded across her chest. "Yes. That would be me." The manager's face drained of color. He knew exactly who she was. Maya Johnson wasn't just another passenger. She was the CEO of MJ Technologies, a global powerhouse in artificial intelligence and digital infrastructure. She was the woman his airline's board had been courting for nearly 6 months, trying desperately to close a $5 billion partnership that would modernize their systems and give them a competitive edge. And now, his staff had just dragged her through the airport like a criminal. I am so sorry, Ms. Johnson," the manager stammered, rushing to smooth things over. "This must all be a misunderstanding. If you'll allow me, we'll correct this immediately." But Maya cut him off, her voice sharp. "No. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is discrimination. Your staff didn't see a CEO walking to first class. They saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance crumbling into shame. The manager tried again, his words tumbling out in desperation. "We assure you, this doesn't represent our airline's values. Please, we can offer an upgrade, a voucher." Maya leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "You think a free flight will erase this? Do you even realize what you've done?" Silence filled the room. The weight of her words pressed down on everyone present. Finally, Maya stood, her voice calm but powerful. "Let me make this simple. My company was prepared to sign a $5 billion contract with this airline. But after today, consider that deal dead." The manager's jaw dropped. The officers froze. What had started as a humiliating incident for Maya had just turned into a catastrophic mistake for the airline. Effective immediately, she continued, "We're withdrawing from all negotiations. If this is how you treat your paying customers, I cannot, in good conscience, entrust you with my company's technology, or my reputation." The manager tried to speak, but no words came out. His mind was already racing, $5 billion gone. Stockholders would demand answers. Executives would lose their jobs. And the videos circulating online? They would make sure the world knew exactly why. Maya picked up her purse, slid her boarding pass back inside, and walked out of the room with her head held high. For the first time since the ordeal began, she smiled. The airline had underestimated her. And now, they were about to learn the cost of their mistake. By the time Maya left the airport that day, the incident had already begun spiraling far beyond anyone's control. What the security officers and the manager failed to realize was that the world outside those walls was watching, and reacting in real time. The videos passengers had recorded spread across social media like wildfire. Clips of Maya being escorted through the terminal, her boarding pass clutched in her hand, were shared with captions like, "She had a first-class ticket, but they pulled her aside anyway. When success still isn't enough. Discrimination on full display." Within hours, hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack, #CEO Justice, and #Airline Scandal were trending worldwide. Influencers, activists, journalists, and even celebrities weighed in, demanding answers from the airline. The images of Maya, composed, elegant, yet clearly wronged, became symbols of the larger fight against discrimination in corporate and public spaces. Behind closed doors, chaos erupted at the airline's headquarters. Executives were in a panic. They had spent months negotiating with Maya's company, banking on that $5 billion deal to modernize their outdated systems. It wasn't just about technology, it was about survival in a fiercely competitive industry. And now, because of one humiliating incident, the deal was gone. Investors reacted swiftly. Stock prices dipped overnight, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting. How could something as small as a routine security check cause this much damage? But those who understood branding and reputation knew the truth: trust is everything. And once it's broken, no amount of money can glue it back together. Meanwhile, Maya's company released a statement that struck like lightning. MJ Technologies has decided to terminate all negotiations with Airline name. We believe in equal treatment, dignity, and respect for every individual. We cannot align ourselves with an organization that fails to uphold those values. The clarity of her words resonated across industries. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for every customer who had been made to feel lesser, for every professional who had been underestimated, for every traveler who had been treated unfairly. The airline scrambled to recover. They issued multiple public apologies, promising an internal investigation and new sensitivity training for staff. Their CEO appeared on television, his face pale, his tone apologetic. But it all sounded hollow. The damage wasn't just financial, it was cultural. People no longer saw the airline as trustworthy. They saw it as biased, careless, and out of touch. For Maya, the fallout wasn't just satisfying, it was empowering. She hadn't set out to make headlines that day. She had simply wanted to board her flight like any other paying customer. But when pushed into humiliation, she turned the moment into a message the whole world could hear. And that message was clear: no company, no matter how powerful, could afford to underestimate someone's worth based on appearances. The airline had lost more than $5 billion that day. They had lost the one thing that money could never buy back: respect. For Maya Johnson, walking out of that airport wasn't just about leaving behind a terrible experience. It was about carrying forward a message that the world desperately needed to hear. She could have remained silent, brushed off the humiliation, and continued with business as usual. After all, her company had plenty of other opportunities waiting. But Maya knew this moment was bigger than her. In the days that followed, her story dominated headlines. News anchors replayed the videos, analysts discussed the fallout, and everyday people shared their own experiences of being judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of who they were. Maya had become a symbol, not just of success, but of resistance against prejudice and injustice. When she finally spoke publicly, the world listened. Standing at a press conference, cameras flashing and microphones pointed her way, Maya's words were steady and powerful. I could have signed that deal and ignored what happened to me. But this isn't just about one seat on one plane. It's about the millions of people who are judged before they are heard, who are treated as if they don't belong. Sometimes, walking away from money is the only way to stand up for dignity. The crowd erupted in applause. Across social media, her words were shared by millions, inspiring entrepreneurs, students, and professionals alike. People began calling her decision the $5 billion stand, a reminder that true leadership isn't measured by profits but by principles. For the airline, the nightmare continued. Their reputation was tarnished beyond repair. Passengers canceled flights, choosing competitors instead. Shareholders demanded new leadership, arguing that no company could afford such a catastrophic misstep. What had begun as a single act of prejudice by two employees had rippled outward, shaking the very foundation of the business. But Maya wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't celebrating their downfall. She was focused on the lesson. In interviews, she emphasized that this wasn't about her being a CEO, it was about being human. It doesn't matter if you're a janitor, a teacher, or a billionaire, she said. Every person deserves respect. If my story forces companies to think twice before making assumptions, then it was worth it. And that became the real legacy of the incident. Universities used her story in business ethics classes. Leaders in other industries reevaluated their policies, understanding that culture and respect mattered just as much as profits. Young people, especially women and minorities, looked to Maya as proof that they didn't have to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's idea of success. For those who followed her journey, Maya's story became more than just news, it became a lesson. A lesson that respect is priceless. A lesson that leadership means taking a stand, even when it costs you billions. And a lesson that sometimes the most powerful move isn't signing a deal, but tearing it up to protect your dignity. Maya Johnson walked into the airport that day as just another passenger. She walked out as a global example of what it means to stand tall when the world tries to cut you down. And for the airline, the message was clear: money can buy planes, but it can't buy back respect once it's lost. And that's how Maya Johnson turned a moment of humiliation into a message heard around the world. Respect, dignity, and equality, worth far more than money. What do you think? Did the airline deserve to lose $5 billion? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this story inspiring, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss more powerful stories like this.